Wed her to me. When I offered up my crown, you said I could have anything. I want Rhaenyra. I take her as she is and wed her in the tradition of our house.
So, this is one of those ideas I've seen requested a couple times on my channel, and I'm sure it's one a lot of us have been wondering about since episode 4 of House of the Dragon. In episode 4 of House of the Dragon, Prince Daemon finally returns from his conflict in the Stepstones, and on the night of his return, he decides to celebrate by taking his niece Rhaenyra out for a night on the town. The escapade leads them to a brothel where things get a bit heated fast, but cool down just as quickly when Daemon backs out and leaves his niece stranded in this brothel. Later on, he's confronted by his brother, King Viserys, and contrary to what actually happened that night, he plays into this narrative that he actually slept with Rhaenyra. He tries to use this as an excuse to get what he wants. Since he supposedly deflowered the princess, maybe that will give Viserys enough incentive to let him marry her. But this only serves to piss Viserys off. He doesn't exactly seem eager to make his brother into his son-in-law. After trying and failing to convince his brother with the promise of Targaryen realness, he's exiled to the Vale. But this is short-lived since he does come back and eventually, over a decade later, gets to marry his niece. Now, it's often debated just how good of a match this really is. Some people regard this as a love story for the ages, and others, like myself, find it plain creepy. Age gap aside, the fact that Daemon has known Rhaenyra since she was a baby and is now having babies with her is pretty off-putting, but I've already made a video dissecting this relationship. Regardless of if they're a good match for one another or not, this relationship has garnered a lot of attention, whether of support or of questions, and one of those questions is what we have here today. To a lot of people, including the two in question, the coupling of Daemon and Rhaenyra is a power couple that should be unstoppable. But is that true? Is Daemon and Rhaenyra the answer to everything? What if they didn't have to wait years to get together? What if they never had to murder a person and fake another's death to get what they really wanted? What if this connection was allowed to flourish years ago? What if Viserys saw sense in his brother's words and allowed him to marry his daughter? How could the story and Westeros change? We'll set the stage in episode 4. Daemon has been confronted by a seething Viserys, and it's as his brother holds his knife to his throat that the prince lays his intentions bare. He wishes to marry Princess Rhaenyra, to return the House of the Dragon to its former glory. In canon, as mentioned already, Viserys rejected this offer rather fiercely, and in this timeline, things are no different, at least at first. While Viserys is resistant, we'll say that Daemon finds other ways to get to his brother. Instead of just trying to pressure his brother and make it seem like he has somewhat noble intentions like making the Targaryen line great again, we'll say that during this interaction, he actually uses Viserys' own logic against him.
You have ruined her. What lord will wed her now in this condition?
Daemon echoes his thoughts instead of trying to goad him on. What lord will wed Rhaenyra now? She's been
sullied.
That angers Viserys, but Daemon continues, saying that men are prideful creatures, and most men won't take her as she is. But he will. If he wants to keep her reputation, her image intact, he is the only option. Instead of telling Viserys not to care what anyone else thinks, Daemon in this timeline plays into Viserys' fears. He has no problem lying to try and manipulate his brother, so I don't think this is too far off from something that he would do. In a way, it's like Daemon's words are a subtle threat, like do this or there will be consequences, like people potentially finding out what happened. Kinda like what Alicent does in episode 8.
And though I believe you were not to blame, others might not be so trusting. They might think you're trying to besmirch the prince, or worse, that you're the sort of girl that might have enticed him in the first place.
By using these fears mixed with a genuine concern and a logical thought process, they can get what they want. So by playing on Viserys' fears, he gets his brother to consider it. But there is one glaring issue here.
You're already wed.
Daemon mentions a couple times in the series that he wishes to take a second wife, like Aegon the Conqueror did, but the big issue is that Daemon is not Aegon the Conqueror. Aegon the Conqueror is kind of unique when it comes to Targaryens. He got away with a lot because of who he was and what he did. With the help of his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, Aegon managed to bring 6 kingdoms to their knees. I say 6 and not 7 because even though Dorne is considered a part of the 7 kingdoms, they were never actually subjugated. They were the only kingdom able to successfully fend off Aegon and his sisters, even killing one of them, his love, Rhaenys Targaryen, and her dragon, Meraxes. Though there is some debate on how she actually might have died. Either way, my point is, despite having help, Aegon established himself as a guy not to be messed with. He proved that he could take down kingdoms on a whim, so most people wouldn't mess with him. His sons, on the other hand, were different. The reigns of Aenys and Maegor were filled with rebellion. When Aenys tried to wed his son to his daughter, the lords weren't happy about that, and the faith rose to fight and depose him. Same thing happened with Maegor. Maegor the Cruel took 6 wives at the same time, and you can imagine how the people in the faith felt about that one. Even though he had Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest dragon in the world, bigger than Vhagar, and Vhagar through his mother Visenya, people still rose to fight him. So imagine what could happen if Daemon took another wife. While sure he wouldn't mind fighting for what he wants, it wouldn't be a good idea. Not that he wants Rhaenyra anyway. Targaryen incest is only tolerated by the faith. Polygamy is a whole other story. So the only way for him to marry Rhaenyra without any real backlash would be for him to divorce Rhaenyra. Now, this could sour Daemon's already strained relationship with the Vale, but I doubt he or Rhaenyra would actually care for that matter. Their marriage was never consummated, therefore unfruitful, and assuming that that's enough, getting an annulment may be rather easy. So Viserys agrees to his brother's proposal and must set off to the Vale to get Lady Rhea's support in the matter and confirm that they never really consummated their marriage. And later on, Rhaenyra is given the news that she will marry her uncle. It's a somewhat similar conversation between Viserys and Rhaenyra in canon, where he calls her out on her reckless behavior, but this time around we'll say that all's well that ends well. A slight change that I could see happening during this conversation is that Rhaenyra doesn't request the removal of Otto Hightower like she did in the canon. In the show, this conversation was kind of like a I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, where she says she'll marry Laenor and do her duty, but only if Viserys does his and removes Otto.
I will do my duties, and with Sir Laenor.
But you must first do yours as king.
The way I interpret this scene is kind of like, I'll make things easy on you and do as you say, but only if you do this. So in this timeline, with Rhaenyra not being used as a political device to bring the Velaryons back into the fold, she may not feel as offended as she did before being forced to marry, especially since the man she's being forced to marry, she actually carries a bit of a torch for. So even if she does call out Otto to her father like she did in canon, she doesn't have the Velaryon marriage to stand on and make him do anything about it. So Otto gets to stay around for now, and in episode 5 we start preparing for the wedding between Daemon and Rhaenyra. With the announcement of Rhaenyra and Daemon's marriage, I would say Alicent becomes a bit suspicious of the arrangement, because Rhaenyra, like in canon, swore in this timeline that nothing happened between her and her uncle, and now here they are about to be married and she doesn't seem to be complaining. So, like in canon, Larys once again gets into her head and causes her to investigate. Before that, though, we get a similar scene like we did in canon where Criston Cole approaches the princess. This time, instead of being on a boat, the two of them are in her room. Criston Cole, like in canon, proposes to Rhaenyra, citing the same evidence he originally used for her marriage to Laenor for Prince Daemon.
So Laenor is a good and decent man, but you did not choose him. He was chosen for you.
Now, he may not have the same sentiment about Daemon as he does for Laenor, given that, well, he's Daemon, but the point still stands. He wants to run away with Rhaenyra. Now, in the original timeline, Rhaenyra turns Cole down, but offers that he can still be a protector with the added benefits of being her paramour, which, now that I think about it, could actually be an interesting video to do at some point. What if Criston Cole accepted her offer? I'm gonna think about that one, but moving on. The difference with this conversation, though, is that while Criston's proposal is likely still turned down, I don't actually think she'll offer to keep sleeping with Criston Cole like she did before. In canon, it was different. She and Laenor, while friends, did not have an attraction to one another. So while they still wanted to do their duties, they'd have to indulge themselves and find pleasure elsewhere. This was a pact of interest, which later evolves into one of necessity, since on top of being gay, Laenor also seems to be incapable of actually giving Rhaenyra children that they need. With her marriage to Daemon, she has none of those problems that she had with Laenor. She can indulge herself with her husband. She can produce heirs with her husband. There's no real need to keep Criston around. I don't personally see it in Rhaenyra's character, reckless as she can be, to attempt juggling romantic relationships with two guys at the same time. That would be kinda dumb. I'll leave that idea to some other degenerate out there on the internet in the world, but either way, I see Rhaenyra cutting Criston Cole off, and I will venture to say that this rejection ends up being a bit worse than it was than in canon, because not only did she refuse him, she slept with him and now wants him to act like it never happened. To hold the door! While she and Daemon get up to something unholy for who knows how many nights. It seems like he was used, like he was just a night of fun, disposable, and he ruined his life for nothing. So when Alicent comes asking, like in canon, Criston confesses. So we move on to the wedding. This time, there are no Velaryons present. This is purely a Targaryen wedding, and as the ceremony continues, Alicent once again appears in her green gown. The Hightowers rise to meet her, including her father, who is still around, and the Hand seems kind of proud of his daughter for declaring war. So it's clear that there will be some conflict in this timeline. The ceremony proceeds, and while this happens, Criston Cole looks on similarly to how he did in canon. Now, this time around, Criston Cole isn't going to attack anyone. Despite his mental state being kind of unstable, the only reason he attacked anyone in canon is because Joffrey Lonmouth couldn't keep his mouth shut. Because he let on that he knew Criston's secret, it caused the knight even more stress in addition to what he was already dealing with, and made him attack. This is what I believe sent him into a rage. If no one, say Daemon, is actively trying to find out who Rhaenyra's lover was and goes up to him to talk about it, Criston Cole may be fine just brooding in silence and changing sides later on. Assuming Rhaenyra doesn't say anything before or during the ceremony to her uncle, I don't see Daemon singling Criston out, because something like that would definitely be in his character to do. But the ceremony ends without a hitch. No commotion, no faces getting smashed in like a pumpkin pie. Daemon and Rhaenyra get married, and then the king faints, and then we move on to episode 6. So right away, there are some changes that occur as a result of this marriage. Well, for starters, not one, but 2 Velaryon Targaryen weddings do not take place. Rhaenyra never marries Laenor, and Daemon never marries Laena. This means that Rhaenyra never has to take a lover in Harwin Strong, so her sons Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey are never born. And since Daemon never marries Laena, this effectively erases Baela and Rhaena from the timeline. Any child born from this marriage between niece and uncle would be legitimate and born with the name Targaryen, not Velaryon or Strong. This also means that the children aren't in line to inherit anything but the Iron Throne. One benefit of a marriage between Laenor or Harwin Strong or someone else outside the Targaryen royal family would have been that multiple kids would have had titles, wealth, and even armies to inherit. Rhaenyra is heir to the throne. Daemon is heir to nothing. He has no lands, vast wealth, or titles to pass on to his children. So while marrying him gave Rhaenyra an additional dragon rider, and a strengthened claim to the throne, and a strong right hand, there are no other tangible benefits to wedding Daemon. Moving on though, like in canon, Rhaenyra starts out with 3 kids. Since Daemon is the father this time, these are completely new characters to the story. We'll say they start out with 2 sons and a daughter, kind of like they did later on in the canon timeline with young Aegon and Viserys, followed by baby Visenya, who unfortunately passed on before her time. Their kids this time around, though, are named Baelon, Aerion, and their young daughter, taking the place of baby Joffrey, is named Visenya. Even though she's not the same one from the canon timeline, Rhaenyra would most likely still name her daughter this because she always wanted a Visenya in the family. Now, with all her children being born legitimate in this timeline, Rhaenyra doesn't have to worry about rumors spreading about her children. Because she doesn't have to deal with that, and the constant feeling that the walls are closing in on her, she most likely won't feel like she has to leave King's Landing like in canon. And even if she did feel concerned, I doubt Daemon would just let her up and leave. He's so stubborn, he tried to face things head on.
And gods be damned, I will not see it ended on the account of this. Say it.
But moving forward, with Daemon married to Rhaenyra, this means he never takes a trip to Pentos. And with them not going to Dragonstone for the time being, Daemon will most likely be a more active part in the court than he was originally. So with the presence of the king's brother and daughter, it won't be as easy for someone like Otto to move pieces around. So there is bound to be some conflict. And one of those moments could be Rhaenyra trying to betroth her son Baelon to Alicent's daughter, Helaena. Now, in canon, the attempted betrothal between Jace and Helaena was a cry for help from Rhaenyra. She needed some form of security since the tables were turning on her. This wasn't just her trying to bring peace or extend an olive branch. Her sons were bastards. By marrying Jace to Helaena, he would have been given some form of legitimacy, and Helaena could be used as a political hostage if necessary. With all of her children being legitimate this time around, she'd probably be less desperate or pressed for a marriage than she was in canon. But say she still goes for this route for whatever reason, I could easily see some conflict here because this isn't just between Alicent and Rhaenyra anymore. This would be between Alicent, Rhaenyra, Daemon, and Otto. Viserys would still act as a bystander, of course, even though Helaena is his daughter too. So the proposal would go about the same as in canon. Rhaenyra makes the offer. Alicent may see the reason in it, given that Rhaenyra's reputation would be better this time around, given she's not having affairs or bastards. Otto, though, would be different. Even though Alicent is the queen, I could easily see Otto taking the reins of this conversation as her father. Even though Rhaenyra has a better reputation, someone like Otto is never going to let her ascend to the throne peacefully or gain any sort of advantage. After Viserys remarks on how good this proposition is, Otto would chime in agreeing with the king, but saying that it has to be taken into consideration. Daemon chimes in next, asking what there is to consider, and that his wife was talking to the queen, not the hand. So everyone looks at Alicent expecting an answer, but the one she really focuses on is her father. This is who she ultimately gives into. It's kind of like Cersei and Tywin in Game of Thrones, how Cersei is royalty by marriage, but her father still holds a lot of power over her.
You're still fertile, you need to marry again and breed.
I am Queen Regent, not some brood mare.
You're my daughter! You will do as I command, and you will marry Loras Tyrell.
So she claims that she will consider the offer, and the meeting is adjourned. But this isn't the end of the conversation. Alicent and Otto will continue this conversation in private. Moving on, some other changes that happen as a result of this new timeline is that Harwin Strong and Lionel Strong will still be alive because they aren't as close to the fire this time around. Pun not intended. Since Lionel Strong is not Hand of the King and Harwin is not the princess's lover, there is no real reason for them to get taken out by Larys, at least not yet. So that's nice. When episode 7 rolls around, I'd say this is where a lot of the real interesting changes start to occur though. Since Daemon doesn't get with Laena, assuming things go well for her, she'll most likely still be alive during episode 7, so there won't be a funeral on Driftmark. And if Laena lives, that means that Vhagar won't be free for anyone to claim. So Aemon probably remains dragonless for the time being. So since we aren't having a funeral this time around, we'll need something to replace it. Since Daemon and Rhaenyra wed, this will raise 2 marriages and alliances to the Velaryon family. And with this family being the richest house in the realm, with a sizable navy and dragons, one of them being the largest in the world, and they have a claim to the Iron Throne through Rhaenys, it's not hard to see how they could be a threat, and it's best they bring them back to the fold sooner rather than later. So I say in this timeline, the proposal that takes place between the families in episode 5 happens here since we don't have a funeral. The Velaryons could make a great asset or a great enemy depending on what happens. So what better way to make friends than with a marriage proposal? This, I would say, is brought on by Otto. His plan, in this timeline, assuming that Laena is still unwed, is to marry her to Aegon. Originally, in the canon timeline, after being turned down by Viserys, before she got with Daemon, Laena was actually set up to marry the son of the Sea Lord of Braavos, the ruler of the free city of Braavos. But before anything could happen, the Sea Lord died. His son didn't take his place because the position of Sea Lord is not hereditary. So he didn't have the same power and influence, which caused Corlys to postpone any kind of marriage. It was around this time that Daemon took an interest in marrying Laena, so he fought the Sea Lord's son and killed him to get her. So in this timeline, I would say things go somewhat the same, excluding Daemon killing the Sea Lord's son. Since the Sea Lord's son held no power of his own after his dad died, with Corlys being such a prideful and ambitious man, I could see him breaking things off sooner or later, assuming he couldn't get his dad's position back, which would leave Laena open to marry. And as I mentioned before, assuming that she isn't, that's perfect for someone like Otto. And it wouldn't even be that hard for him to convince Viserys. All you have to do is convince Viserys that the Velaryons were a potential threat that would be better allies than enemies. Lionel Strong does the same thing in canon as well. And by knowing how much of a prideful man Corlys is, what would be better than the king's firstborn son for his only daughter? The reason I don't see Aegon being pushed to marry Helaena in this timeline like he does in canon is because of, well, what I just said. The Velaryons are a dangerous rogue element. And in canon, the Velaryons were already tied to Rhaenyra and Daemon, so it makes sense why none of the Greens pushed for an alliance through marriage with them until Daemon offered a potential alternative. Here, though, they're free game, and wedding Aegon to Helaena serves no real purpose. Even if the marriage makes Aegon look more legitimate, Helaena doesn't really offer anything politically, kinda like Daemon. Sure, maybe a stronger claim, an additional dragon, but what lands, wealth, or soldiers do you get out of that? What alliances? And with someone like Daemon around and not going anywhere anytime soon, I definitely see someone like Otto trying to play his cards right. And if you think Laena may be too old to produce heirs, I'd say, well, you're absolutely wrong. She was only around 15 when her brother married Rhaenyra, so 10 years later, she was only 25. So even if Aegon is young, there is still nothing wrong with this match. So in this timeline, if the deal goes through, Aegon would marry Laena, which would give the Greens House Velaryon, their fleets, wealth, and their dragons, Vhagar primarily. This could pose a problem. Moving on from this, though, episode 8 would also be very different since we wouldn't have that petition for Driftmark. In this timeline, Rhaenyra probably never died in her 20s, and Rhaenyra most likely never had to fake his death because he's not married to Rhaenyra. Corlys wouldn't be so overwhelmed by grief, he'd abandon Driftmark for war to drown his sorrows and then get injured, which would call the succession into question. And even if something happened to him, Rhaenyra would still be around to be Lord of the Tides. The family dinner most likely still happens though, but this time there's no fight breaking out because the kids would be on better terms. Aemon would have never lost his eyes as he never claimed Vaegon got into a fight with Rhaenyra's sons. But the biggest question I believe we have is, would Rhaenyra stay in King's Landing during the entire 6-year time jump? Originally, Rhaenyra left for Dragonstone to get away from the rumors, but those don't exist now, and someone as headstrong as Daemon most likely wouldn't allow her to leave even if they were around. So I don't necessarily see them being forced out. I could see them staying, or I could see them leaving of their own accord. Dragonstone is supposed to be the place where the heir learns to rule, so it would make sense if they did choose to leave at some point. The real big question, though, is what would happen when Viserys dies? If they stay, who would get word of it first? Assuming it's Rhaenyra and Daemon, they most definitely immediately begin making preparations for her to rise to power. Assuming it's Alicent, like it was in canon, she'd now be faced with a choice. Tell her friend, who she may be on better terms with in this timeline, or tell her father and the council, and it's almost certain what they would do. Honestly, I feel like there is so much that I could tackle with this what if, in different directions to take it in as well. Like, for example, I kept Otto in this video to keep the conflict going, since if he's still around, it doesn't matter what Alicent thinks or does, he's going to make Aegon king no matter what. But had I removed him, Lando Strong would become Hand of the King. And assuming something happened to him via Larys or some accident, the thought crosses my mind, would Daemon have managed to convince his brother to make him Hand of the King instead? Then there's also Team Black in general. If conflict were to arise, their main support was the Velaryons. With those original marriages and alliances erased, who could help them now? Perhaps they'd be the ones to ally with the Baratheons if conflict came around in this timeline. Since Balon, Jace in this timeline, and Aerion, Luke in this timeline, wouldn't be connected to House Velaryon through Baelum and Rhaena. They could potentially marry outside of the royal family and garner more support that way. Then there's also Visenya and any other children Daemon and Rhaenyra may end up having. So who knows? So much could change from Rhaenyra marrying Daemon if I'm being honest. And once again, I'm gonna have to stop things here before this video gets too long and I turn this into a fanfic video. Either way, these are just some of my thoughts and ideas. Feel free to tell me some of yours in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.